This is a great pleasure to welcome Allison Levy, who is a tutor at St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico, wherever that is, I don't know. She recently got tenure, which means she might say anything. So we're going to be on the edge of our seats. Allison got her PhD from Boston College in 2015, and she wrote a dissertation entitled The Psychology of Athenian Imperialism in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. It is unpublished as of yet, but it is remarkable and among the best work out there on Thucydides, I think. So it's a great honor to have Allison here with us today to talk about her work.
Thank you, Dustin, and thank you so much for having me, everybody for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here. Okay, so I'll just jump right in. A central theme of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, his account of the 27-year conflagration sparked by Athens and Sparta in 431 BC, which engulfed nearly the whole of Greece and did much ultimately to destroy the Greek city-state, is hope. As has been widely observed by scholars of various stripes, Thucydides seems to like hope a little less than we do. Though Americans may be feeling less of it these days, I don't know, I think we still tend not to see hope as a profound political problem to be attended to by students of human nature and carefully managed by serious political leaders. Thucydides does see things that way, it seems to me, and one of the most wonderful aspects of his work is the modeling of such thought and management. My project focuses on Athens in particular, the city at the center of the work, whose extremely hopeful and energetic imperialism, Thucydides tells us, frightened Sparta into going to war against it. I try to look closely at the leadership of Athens' most prominent statesmen as they manage and mismanage the city and empire over the course of the war. Now, Thucydides' Athens has held a fascination for many people, and much has been written on this subject. It's easy to see why. In some crucial respects, the daring and sophisticated Athenians bring moral and intellectual virtue to a very high pitch. Even their enemies, the Corinthians, describe them as follows. Quote, "They use their bodies for the sake of their city as if they were not their own, but their mind as most properly their own, for doing anything for the city. And regarding what they go after and obtain, they consider that they have accomplished little in comparison with what the future will bring. But if it happens that they try a thing and fail, they conceive new hopes to fill the lack. And they toil in these ways, with all troubles and dangers, throughout their whole life, and they least enjoy what they have, because they are always seeking more. And they believe there to be no other holiday than doing what's needed, and they regard untroubled peace to be no less a misfortune than leisureless hardship. Therefore, if someone should sum up and say that they were born neither to have peace themselves, nor to let other men have it, he would speak rightly." End quote. This characterization rings true in many respects. The greatness of the Athenians, together with certain of their qualities that seem modern, in particular their emphasis on enlightenment, progressivism, and appreciation of the individual, make the Athenians compelling in themselves and in their resemblance to us. Thucydides' famous remark that he intends his work to be a possession for all time, together with related claims that the Peloponnesian War is singularly worthy of study because it brings to light fundamental aspects of our nature, gives further reason to study the city at the center of his work. For all that's impressive about them, though, the Athenians are the losers in this war, and Thucydides writes in such a way as to make central the question of why. To return to the Corinthian view quoted above, this characterization of the Athenians helps account for the terms in which many scholars understand their demise. They were too hopeful, too hubristic, they overreached. In particular, they were so foolish as to attempt the conquest of all of Sicily, while still in the midst of a war with the greatest land power in Greece, a blunder which replenished their already impressive store of enemies and wiped out almost the whole of their fighting forces. However, as other scholars have pointed out, Thucydides' own judgment of what went wrong is rather different. Following the death of the singular leader Pericles, he says, the quality of Athenian leadership declined dramatically. From this decline, there resulted many mistakes, including the disastrous attempt to conquer Sicily, which, however, he says, quote, was not so much an error of judgment when we consider the enemy they went against, as of how they managed the expedition. Had the Athenians not so bungled their handling of the Sicilian expedition, Thucydides suggests, they could have won. Indeed, so impressive were the Athenians that even with the better part of Greece, plus Sicily, and eventually Persia too, against them, they nonetheless held out in the Peloponnesian War for 10 years after the Sicilian disaster. And they did not ultimately fall to their enemies until internal dissensions had crippled them. The Athenians' internal decay, then, is important to understand. Many scholars have done crucial work on aspects of this decay. They have shown, persuasively to my mind, that the injustice of the Athenians' foreign policy makes a crucial contribution to an excessive concern with private interest that ends up poisoning the city, most damagingly the elite. As Leo Strauss points out, the attachment to glory, so emphasized in imperial Athens under Pericles, and the relative neglect of justice in their foreign policy, encouraged the eventual neglect of the city's common good observed by Thucydides. In addition, the attacks of guilt and panic that grip Athens at crucial points during the Sicilian expedition, which stem from their fear that they had been unjust in their imperialism, lead directly to their failure. To the extent, then, that Pericles' policies set the city or encourage it to go further than necessary on a path that ultimately fosters all these dispositions, Thucydides implies criticism of his leadership. Now, some scholars have taken up this problem of the Athenians' decay and Pericles' shared responsibility for it through an exploration of a problem pertaining to freedom and necessity, which is connected with the problem of hope and which is also a central theme of Thucydides' work. For certain Athenians famously claim that they cannot be held responsible for their controversial imperialism because they've had no choice but to pursue it. At least in the realm of international politics, they say that human beings are not simply strongly motivated, but actually, quote, compelled by fear, honor, and interest. These motives, they claim, have led them to seek an empire, as anyone in a position of similar strength would also have done. Here, then, we see the Athenians responding thoughtfully to a difficulty that confronts all of us, perhaps most obviously in the harsh realm of international politics. For while justice surely demands that leaders attend to the good of their own political community above all, justice is invariably believed also to demand something of us towards those outside of our community. No people consistently believe they can treat others in any way whatever, and this is a demand we feel somehow free to meet. On the other hand, international politics makes us very aware of harsh threats to our community's continued existence, threats which, in principle, could require infinite resources to meet and which threaten to obliterate any sphere of freedom. It is therefore no surprise that leaders struggle, in Thucydides' time and in ours, to articulate a clear and consistent sense in which we are, on the one hand, free, and on the other, bound by necessity. Part of the interest the history holds, then, and perhaps some evidence of the claim that it will be relevant, as Thucydides says, quote, as long as human nature remains the same, is found in the comprehensiveness of the responses its characters offer to the problem presented by these conflicting demands and the confusion that results from them. Thucydides presents us with one city which attempts to deal with this problem by denying freedom in international affairs, as Athens does, and with another, Sparta, which in effect denies necessity. The Spartans accomplish this by lying to others and themselves, claiming that every nasty action they take for Sparta's advantage is actually taken out of concern for justice. While this approach has its advantages, its rank hypocrisy and thoughtlessness makes Sparta less interesting than the more thoughtful Athens. In addition, this view is also not something the Spartans are consistently able to live with, and some very dangerous consequences follow from the guilt that their hypocrisy stirs in them. Yet the Athenians' attempted solution is also problematic. Their argument relies on shuffling things usually thought to belong in the freedom column, the pursuit of honor, the pursuit of advantage, over into the necessity column. That is, in common experience, we tend to feel and call necessary those things experienced as undesirable, which we pursue or accept to avoid something worse. Perhaps we all experience, say, a threat to our life as a terrible constraint on our behavior. Hence we say that someone who killed in self-defense had no choice but to do so. But these Athenians suggest that, in the absence of terrible peril and the felt necessity to defend themselves from it, they do not feel free. The concerns for advantage and glory seem compelling to them, and, as they claim, to everyone else. This compulsion argument, they say, absolves them of moral responsibility for the admittedly ugly consequences their safety, glory, and advantage-seeking often entail for others. However, they cannot be consistent about this. These same Athenians also claim they are, quote, worthy to rule, and otherwise suggest that they are just and noble. That is, that they are free in certain fundamental respects on which the possibility of all moral virtue rests. As noted, some scholars from whose work I have greatly benefited have brought out clearly this fact that the Athenians contradict themselves, and they've been very helpful in beginning to show why the Athenians must do so. However, it seems to me that there's more to do to understand how exactly this contradiction plays out for them, how the contradictory elements of their understanding fit together, how this complicated tangle contributes to the deterioration of the Athenian Empire and prosecution of the Peloponnesian War over time, and how study of it elucidates the character of Athenian hope as it is actually experienced. Today I'd like to focus on the way this contradiction turns up in Pericles' speeches, a study that yields further insight into the greatness of Pericles' leadership, the connection between the Athenians' hopes and their virtue, and the difference between justice and nobility. First, we should note that Pericles does not explicitly make the radical statement about the compulsion of fear, honor, and interest noted above. Thucydides only puts that statement in the mouths of anonymous Athenian envoys speaking outside the city of Athens. When Pericles speaks of necessity, he sticks to the more common sense use of the term, which refers to obviously undesirable things most of us would wish to avoid. For example, he speaks of the necessity of accepting burdensome war with Athens' enemies to avoid the worst evil of being enslaved by them, and the necessity of allowing the Spartans to destroy houses and lands in the Athenian countryside to avoid the great danger of fighting the Spartans on land, where they have a numerical superiority to the Athenian fighting forces. Nonetheless, certain striking aspects of Pericles' speeches draw on, or are at least consistent with, the radical statement about necessity. For example, and as others have pointed out, appeals to justice and piety are left almost entirely out of his speeches. Now, as we said, like the envoys, Pericles too contradicts himself about whether the Athenians are compelled or free. At times, he tells them that their empire is the result of the ugly compulsion of fear. At other times, he says it is freely chosen and extremely noble. For example, in the funeral oration, in speaking of the cities subject to Athens and Athenian liberality towards them, he says, quote, "As to virtue, we differ largely from most men. For we acquire friends not by being done good, but by doing good. And the firmer friend is the one who does the kindness or act of grace," end quote. In his third speech, however, in warning the Athenians that it's impossible for them to end the war with Sparta, or to give up their empire even if they'd like to, he says, quote, "You hold this rule like a tyranny, which seems unjust to have taken, but which is dangerous to let go," end quote. Indeed, this wavering is apparent throughout Pericles' speeches, in his descriptions of the empire, the war with Sparta, and war generally. Very fine scholars of Thucydides have stressed the incoherence of the Periclean position, especially as regards the empire. Helpfully, some have argued that the inability consistently to stick to the compulsion argument is bound up with the Athenians' desire to think themselves morally virtuous, not least because of the very great hopes that a sense of virtue brings, in particular, the hope to be rewarded for their moral virtue by benevolent gods. While I have found such an interpretive approach very helpful, it seems to me that further analysis of Pericles' speeches and of crucial parts of Thucydides' account of the period following Pericles' death brings out additional considerations, some of which are at odds with the picture of the Athenians sketched above. First, while it is true that there's a logical incoherence in Pericles' approach, it's also true that we shouldn't hold politics to a standard of rigor that is supra-political. As is most convincingly shown in Book 3 of Aristotle's Politics, no regime can be fully coherent. Fully understanding this point might be of the highest importance for a philosophic education, but of course understanding this point isn't sufficient for understanding Thucydides' teaching about politics. For he shows that one of the most important tasks of a leader is to balance the contradictory demands and opinions inevitably fostered by any regime in such a way as to encourage the flourishing of its citizens. It is true that, even if we stay on the political plane, Pericles is vulnerable to serious criticism, as we've already indicated. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the full character and the political benefits of Pericles' artful appeals to freedom and necessity could be further elaborated. However unstable imperial Athens proved to be, something about Pericles' leadership produced, for a time, a city remarkably attentive to the dictates of reason and to nobility, and it's desirable to grasp as fully as possible how that was accomplished. To do this, we begin by observing that while Pericles mixes appeals to freedom and necessity in all three of the speeches Thucydides presents in direct discourse, we see that his emphasis on one appeal over the other varies with the circumstances of each speech. We should note that his funeral oration is a speech enjoined by law for the purpose of eulogizing the first fallen in the war, as opposed to his first and third speeches, which have as their more immediate aims the proposal of specific courses of action and persuasion of the Athenians to adopt them. That is, in the first speech, the aim is to get the Athenians to go to war with Sparta and to prosecute the war in a certain way, and in the third speech, to get them to persevere in this course. This difference in aim, of course, affects the character of the speeches. However, in all his speeches, Pericles encourages the Athenians to understand themselves, and especially their devotion to their empire, in particular ways. And we note that the character of this understanding and the appeals to freedom and necessity Pericles makes in support of it vary, as do the circumstances of the Athenians' material strength and their opinion of that strength. Appeals to necessity are more the focus when the Athenians are frightened or feel themselves to be weak, as on the occasion of Pericles' first and third speeches. The latter occurs during the plague, the former when the Athenians are wavering on the question of whether to submit to Sparta's demands in order to avoid an unwanted war. It is under these conditions that Pericles stresses careful calculation, most importantly of the city's resources, and is, on the whole, relatively more modest in his statements about the goods for which Athenians should long, such as individual safety, the city's safety, not failing to live up to their fathers' reputations, not destroying their own reputation. When the Athenians feel themselves to be stronger, at the time of the funeral oration, when the war is still young, the Athenians have suffered few casualties, and they are, as Thucydides describes them, quote, in the flower of their strength, Pericles stokes greater hopes and makes greater demands of them, such as they should not think about individual safety, they should not think of themselves at all, and later they can look forward to the greatest glory imaginable. Now, of course, when people are weaker, they can do less than when they are stronger, and their leaders must arrange their speeches and plans accordingly. However, Thucydides' presentation here is interesting in the first place because he shows that the greatness of the demands Pericles makes and the hopes he arouses during the funeral oration do not correspond to the material improvement in strength they enjoy there relative to other times. For example, in this speech, in which Pericles claims to eulogize the dead primarily by praising the city they served and the way of life it affords all its citizens, he describes Athens as a city which, unlike Sparta, does not prevent foreigners from witnessing its military exercises, even though enemies might gain an advantage from what they see, because Athenians, quote, trust not to practices and stratagems, rather than to our courage or stoutness of soul. And he claims that in general, Athens is a city which, quote, fearlessly benefits other cities, quote, not so much by calculation of interest as by trust in generosity, end quote. At one point, he also exhorts his audience, whom he encourages to be as willing to sacrifice for Athens as were the fallen men being celebrated on this occasion, to, quote, determine their thoughts against the enemy, considering not in rational calculation alone the benefit, end quote. That is, they should focus not on their own advantage, but rather on being so devoted to their city as to become, quote, erotic lovers of it. And he encourages the hope that from this devotion and the ultimate sacrifice it may require will come not simply glory, nor simply eternal glory, but, quote, an unfelt death that will provoke every man in every land to eternal remembrance of each individual Athenian on every occasion in speech and in deed, he says. However, there's no amount of strength that would rationally justify a policy of dismissing calculation and strategy in favor of a, quote, trust in moral virtue, nor the hope that any individual could be remembered by everyone in every land forever. To summarize, what we observe in the funeral oration is that Pericles speaks to the Athenians when they feel themselves to be in a position of strength in terms of resources and the general sense they have of how much the war has cost them. He then stresses Athens' beauty through an emphasis on the city's strength, together with an artful elaboration of Athens' intellectual and moral virtues. Then he calls for ultimate, explicitly self-forgetting devotion to the city. Then he stokes hopes for a kind of limitless good, namely a certain kind of glory, which goes well beyond what reason could justify. As we noted above, going together with this presentation are explicit calls for the Athenians not to calculate or reason. One might wonder why Pericles needs to speak with such extravagance, of hopes that are not only unreasonable, but that involve an explicit casting off of reason, rather than sticking with a more moderate point, something like, we are relatively strong, and therefore we can hope for quite a bit. But here, I think we see some of the genius of Pericles. For his rhetoric manages a problem of human nature, to which Thucydides points frequently, if subtly, in several places in the history, which is that it is prone to infinite longing, or a longing for a transcendent, limitless good. Thucydides' work suggests that human beings are not simply satisfied with safety, or money, or power, or with other specific goods human beings at various times articulate as desirable. Rather, we seem to want something all-encompassing, and therefore perhaps necessarily inarticulable. Now, before we turn to the question of how exactly Pericles manages this problem, let's say a bit about how it appears in Thucydides' work more broadly. One helpful place to turn is to the account of the Athenian rejection of a Spartan peace offer, which occurs a little later in the war, a few years after Pericles' death. At this time, the Spartans find themselves in a difficult situation, and in their panic, they offer to end the whole Peloponnesian War on terms extremely favorable to the Athenians, explicitly warning the Athenians against the propensity we are discussing. They say, Athens can keep its empire, over which the war is being fought. All they ask is the return of a small number of important Spartans, whom the Athenians are holding captive. Thucydides' description of the Athenian response and their general disposition is striking, for he emphasizes that, at this time, the Athenians are having a run of good luck. Several unexpected victories have fallen recently into their laps, and Thucydides describes them repeatedly during this time as, quote, grasping for more. When they stumble upon this greatest piece of good fortune, the Spartan peace offer, the Athenians reject it. Because, as Thucydides says in his own name, quote, they believed peace could be at hand whenever they wished to make it, and they were grasping for more, end quote. The more in favor of which they reject the very great good of peace with Sparta is not specified, as is characteristic of Thucydides' descriptions of the Athenians at this time. We are told of certain additional concessions the Athenians demand of the Spartans, the return of this or that city that once belonged to them, and that they lost at some point, for example, but nothing is suggested to be of much interest or importance, and certainly not such as to be worth passing up the opportunity to end this great unwanted war. Around the same time, Thucydides elaborates on the current Athenian mood as follows. Quote, "They used their present good fortune to deem themselves worthy to be opposed in nothing, but even to achieve the more impracticable things as equivalent to the possible, whether with means great or deficient. The cause of this was the great success that came contrary to expectation, which gave strength to their hope." End quote. Thus, what moves the Athenians during this time is not exactly a particular good. The vague impulse towards, quote, more, and the character of their rejection of the Spartan peace offer suggests a chafing against the very idea of limits on what they can attain, as does the longing to be, quote, opposed in nothing, with its attendant pleasure of thinking such a thing could be accomplished without regard to resources. A second example of the importance of indeterminate or infinite longing is found in Thucydides' description of the Athenian anticipation of the conquest of Sicily. On the eve of their attempt to acquire this jewel for their imperial crown, Thucydides describes the hopes of the Athenians in terms that they themselves had not used during their deliberations about the expedition. He says that, quote, "Arrows fell upon all alike to sail away. On the old, as they thought that they would either subdue those they sailed against, or that their great power would in no way fall. On those in the flower of life, with a longing for the sight and contemplation of what was not present, and being in good hope of being saved. And on the great mass of people, the army, thinking they would receive money for the present and gain power from which would come everlasting pay." End quote. Here again, Thucydides' emphasis is not on a desire for one concrete good. The prospect of sailing away brings with it a multiplicity of desirable but unstated and not terribly clear objects. That is, we might have expected Thucydides to say, everyone wanted to go to Sicily to make a lot of money or to gain great glory. Instead, thoughts about the expedition vary across the different groups of citizens, and most are strikingly unclear. Thoughts of an undertaking that could in no way fall, which puts men in good hope of being saved, that is, in strong hope of a salvation whose parameters are not specified, and which is to occur in extremely dangerous circumstances, and which promises to procure a power great enough to supply eternal pay. All of this is suggestive of a hazy longing for an infinite good possessed for infinite time. Perhaps the seemingly oddest statement of the hopes, that of those in the prime of life, who, in addition to salvation, are longing for the sight and beholding of what was not present, in fact gives expression to the crucial indeterminacy of the experience, as does the Athenian general Nicias, who had earlier spoken disparagingly of Athens', quote, sick arrows for what is not present. To return to Pericles, he doesn't ignore this extreme and dangerous tendency of human longing, he encourages it. But, and this is one of the most impressive things he accomplishes, in a way that encourages the Athenians to dynamism, but not to a reality-denying foolishness that could destroy the city. Indeed, under him, Thucydides tells us, the city comes to its greatest point. He does this by arousing the infinite longing to which all human beings seem prone, and tethering it to a certain understanding of virtue and to necessity. That is, on the one hand, he encourages the Athenians to think the city infinitely strong and beautiful. For example, his praise of Athens includes claims that, quote, our city is so great that all the goods from all the world come into it, that Athens, quote, has compelled every sea and every land to grant access to our daring, and that, quote, we go against our neighbor's territory by ourselves, and though we are fighting on foreign soil against men defending their own homes, we generally have no difficulty in overcoming them. And indeed, our whole power, taken together, no one has ever yet encountered, end quote. Further, Athenian virtue, on his telling, is subject to no constraint. The Athenians are courageous, not as other men are, through any compulsion of law or burdens of training, but through, quote, living a relaxed life, and through ease. And they overcome the tensions within virtue, an apparent impossibility for other men. As Pericles puts it, quote, we are lovers of beauty, but with economy, and lovers of wisdom without softness. We are most daring, and yet at the same time, most reflective about what we set out to do, whereas other men are bold through ignorance, and reflection brings hesitation, end quote. He also promises the Athenians a good that seems infinitely good, which is a sort of remembrance that is to last an infinite time and make the loss of all other goods seem acceptable. He thereby acknowledges this characteristic longing and calls it up in a way that makes his fellow citizens extremely energetic. At the same time, Pericles confines the potentially disastrous aversion to the very idea of limits and its attendant disparagement of necessity and calculation in various ways. For one thing, the hope for glory, however problematic, does act as a kind of limit on the vague and sprawling hope for an unspecified more toward which human beings tend to drift. While it can seem to answer, plausibly enough, the desire for infinite goodness, it is still something that can be, and under Pericles' direction is, clearly tied to noble virtue, understood in part as self-sacrificing devotion to the city's good. That is, to an important extent, the uncalculating disposition he touts is to be confined to the individual, who is to be uncalculating about his own needs, as he bows completely to the needs, carefully calculated, of the city. To the extent that the city, too, is suggested to be free of the need to calculate, the circumstance in which Pericles most fully paints this picture is, as we noted, in a funeral speech, not a speech recommending a specific course of action the city is about to undertake on a given matter. In speeches that are more immediately and concretely about foreign policy, Pericles is more attentive to the limits or necessities of the city's position, and he encourages his fellow citizens likewise to such attentiveness, with more muted calls to nobility. In his more strategy-heavy speeches, he not only tends to lead them through careful analysis of the particular advantages and limitations of their position relative to the enemies, he also explicitly stresses the idea of necessity, which stress may encourage a general mindfulness of the simple fact that there are limits on what human beings can accomplish, an approach that may seem obvious and unremarkable, except for the many indications Thucydides gives of our reluctance to face it. Our analysis of Pericles' speeches also yields insight into the complicated character of the Athenians' hopes and the particular relation of those hopes to virtue. As noted above, the Athenians are sometimes criticized for a logical inconsistency in their thought. For the presentation Pericles makes might be understood as follows. He encourages his audience to become devoted to the city, that is, most importantly, to be willing to make the greatest sacrifice for it, but he gives them to understand that, in return for this sacrifice, apparently as a reward for it, they will receive a good far more valuable than mere life, or whatever else they are called on to give up, namely immortal glory. Thus, the Athenians are sometimes portrayed as attempting to make a calculated exchange of a lesser good for a greater one. In what sense, then, are they really sacrificing? So some scholars wonder. Why do they deserve any reward for such a thing? From this, the Athenians may appear very focused on calculation, but not particularly good at it. However, as our above analysis suggests, this picture is not quite accurate. At the climax of the funeral oration, Pericles explicitly exhorts the Athenians not to think about their own advantage. As we have noted, he instead encourages them to become erotic lovers of Athens, and I see no reason to deny that he calls forth their sincere willingness to sacrifice in this moment. I find the alternative, the suggestion of a highly calculating notion of mere exchange, to be psychologically implausible, as the self-contradiction in it is immediately obvious. It seems to me, rather, that Pericles is here drawing on a phenomenon that we recognize from ordinary experience and that we see played out in other parts of Thucydides' history, which is the genuine, extremely pleasant self-forgetting human beings tend to experience in the face of beauty, which brings with it an immense sense of well-being and vague hope. This fits with Pericles' description here of those who died fighting for Athens as having experienced, quote, an unfelt death, in strength and together in common hope, end quote. That is, in this image, death is said to be unfelt. This only makes sense to me if one has forgotten oneself. The immediately following reference to being in strength and together in common hope indicates that such a forgetting comes with an unspecified and hazy sense of hope and communal feeling. However true to experience this is, and I think it's very true, it's not the whole story, as it is difficult or impossible for human beings to forget about themselves completely. Indeed, that any hope or sense of one's own well-being is present in this experience already shows this difficulty. And perhaps this is a more pronounced problem for the relatively sophisticated Athenians and the very sophisticated Pericles in particular. Hence, immediately after this description of the hazy hope, Pericles brings in a more concrete good, namely immortal glory, in order to explain and preserve the attraction to an experience that might otherwise seem foolish or bad for the individual. To be clear, I'm contending that glory is the clearest object of hope Pericles puts forth for the Athenians, but in a way it is not the full object of their hope. As we stated earlier, perhaps nothing it is possible to clarify could be. In further support of this last suggestion, we now note that in Thucydides' account of the Athenians' attraction to their greatest imperial adventure, their arrows for the conquest of Sicily, to which we earlier referred, glory was not mentioned. Nor is it mentioned when Diodotus, perhaps Thucydides' most philosophic character, speaks of the human propensity to be led on by eros and hope. He refers instead to freedom and rule as, quote, the greatest things, which most bring men to ruin. This fits with the order of the funeral oration. For at its peak, Pericles exhorts the Athenians to eros for Athens, or perhaps for, quote, the power of the city in action, as I believe the Greek also allows, which he has described as a place of superlative excellence, beauty, and pleasure. What is involved in the beholding of this image, or what is made possible by being absorbed in imagination of it, seems the more fundamental experience of Athenian hope. Perhaps further support for this suggestion is found in the consideration that glory or reputation attempts to capture or preserve something. The memory or speech doing the preserving would seem to be a step removed from, and less fundamental than, what it preserves. Finally, we may find additional support in the fact that Pericles himself gives us pause about glory. To be sure, he doesn't do this in the section of his speeches where he identifies glory as the greatest good. But at the beginning of the funeral oration, for example, he expresses his reluctance to give the speech, and among the reasons he identifies for this reluctance are that it amounts to, quote, risking the virtue of many men to be trusted based on whether one spoke well or poorly, and that envy leads men to disbelieve praise what goes beyond what they think themselves capable of attaining. A bit later in the speech, he speaks of the untrustworthy character of much or even most praise. It is only the Athenians, he says, for whom the word accurately reflects the reality, unlike the rest of the living Greeks and unlike the heroes immortalized by Homer, whose flattery, Pericles says, the Athenians don't need. That Pericles himself speaks of the flimsiness of reputation or glory, then, gives us further reason to doubt that it's the final or deepest good aimed at by himself and his followers. Finally, this analysis brings out the particular contribution of nobility to the Athenian character, as crucially, though not fully distinct from justice and piety. The distinctive importance of nobility seems to me to have been somewhat underemphasized in Thucydides' scholarship. For while it is widely observed that the Athenians are attached to nobility, this is often suggested to amount to an attachment to justice and piety. As we noted above, a common description of the Athenians, offered by some very good students of Thucydides, is of a people hoping, most fundamentally, to be rewarded by gods with immortality for the virtues, like daring, involved in their imperialism. However, this too seems to me somewhat to mischaracterize the Athenians' experience of their empire and their hopes. Part of the difficulty is that this characterization neglects an important feature of nobility that can be observed both in Thucydides' work and in common experience. That is, its relatively amoral aspect. For it seems to me that the noble, as Thucydides presents it, and as is recognizable to us, can be understood as having at least two aspects, which typically have to go together in some measure for us to call something noble unqualifiably. First, a display of excellence or strength that goes beyond what men are typically capable of, which we tend to admire and take pleasure in contemplating without regard to our own interest. And second, devotion to and possibly sacrifice for a beautiful object. Only this second aspect, it seems to me, tends towards being fully moral or deeply bound up with justice. Thus, while it is true that it is difficult or impossible to understand oneself as noble when one has clearly in mind one's injustice, as sometimes happens to the Athenians, nonetheless, the concern with strength and excellence and the virtues more associated with these can take priority in one's mind and permit pretty wide latitude as regards justice. Such an emphasis may go together, as it does in the Athenians, with unusual, though surely not complete, thoughtfulness and dynamic hopefulness. To see something of this, it's helpful to note that while both nobility and justice demand that we give up certain goods, the standpoint from which we view those forsaken goods tends to differ. For justice seems to demand that we restrain ourselves from certain things because they are wrong, or because certain goods belong to people other than ourselves, whereas nobility tends to paint such goods as low, insufficiently worthy of our attention. That is, it directs us to avoid them because they are not good enough. There's an aspect of nobility, then, that is more obviously consistent with a concern for our own good than is, say, justice, and which contributes to the Athenians' energy. The other side of the coin is that nobility is more tolerant of behavior that's not well looked on by the gods, which, it seems to me, pushes against the idea that the Athenians' hopes are predominantly for divine rewards. This observation helps us to understand what might otherwise look like a very blatant inconsistency on the part of Pericles and the Athenians he led. For if our attachment to virtue were essentially exhausted by the notion of justice, and in particular by its self-sacrificial aspect, it would be difficult to understand how Pericles could stress the high-minded, morally serious character of Athenian imperialism, while emphasizing overwhelmingly Athenian power and glory, and while hardly mentioning and even gently disparaging justice. If we focus on the suggestion that nobility is attractive to us apart from any consideration of our own good, while also appearing beneficial to us in an immediate way that justice often does not, to repeat, especially because of its emphasis on strength or excellence, we find that Pericles' rhetoric appears less strikingly self-contradictory and more artful in its imperfect but plausible attempt to bring together self-interest and moral virtue. We note that there is something odd and revealing about the fact that Pericles takes up the task of justifying individual sacrifice on behalf of the city, which is not something we see leaders of other cities doing in Thucydides' work. In light of the fact that Athens is a city involved in an imperialism of questionable justice, and that Pericles evidently does not make it a priority to bolster the Athenian sense of their justice, factors which complicate the citizens' relationship to the city and their acceptance of its burdens, it's understandable that Pericles thinks he must make such a defense. In other words, there's something corrupt about Athens, and in communities felt to be corrupt, perhaps devotion to one city can't be taken for granted. However, this is not to say that Pericles is addressing a group of individuals to whom some understanding of moral virtue isn't deeply attractive. Rather, in this circumstance, we see the enduring and perhaps increased appeal to such people of nobility. The importance of strength to this account helps clarify how this works. That is, the place of strength in the Athenian conception of nobility makes it easier to understand how such relatively corrupt men remain attracted to it. For in Pericles' speeches, strength comes to sight as the proof to which hard-nosed, reasonable Athenians should look for evidence of their excellence, as well as the obvious sign of the utility of that excellence. Similarly, Pericles' emphasis on the ease with which Athens' immense strength allows the city to accomplish difficult tasks, prepares and makes seem less burdensome his eventual acknowledgement that great sacrifices will in fact be demanded of the citizens. At the same time, he directs the Athenians to engage in what turns out to be a very different kind of looking, a beholding or gazing at their strength, the beauty of which leads them out of themselves and encourages them not to calculate their personal benefit. The significance of Pericles' general procedure and its implications for the character of Athenian hopefulness become clearer when we consider the Athenian leaders who followed him. We can treat these only briefly here. First, we meet the demagogue Cleon, in whom Periclean sophistication has curled into cynicism. His Athens first policy mixes an ugly lack of regard for the treatment of other cities, a more extreme and vulgar iteration of Periclean skepticism about justice, with bloodlust and flattery of the demos, or the many poor in the city with whom he is most influential. For all his cleverness, and he is very clever, Cleon speaks rarely and poorly about necessity, and he never mentions the word noble, except when he uses it as an insult for the city's elite, against whom he is keen to foment the demos' suspicion. He also spends a fair bit of time undermining or denying those aspects of the city that had, on Pericles' telling, constituted the city's beauty and worthiness, such as its thoughtfulness and relative generosity to other cities. The most noteworthy things the Athenians accomplish under Cleon's influence are, first, nearly to exterminate a subject city that has attempted to revolt from Athens, and even better, to reject the Spartan peace offer we spoke of earlier. In the Athenians' general disposition under Cleon, we see a resistance to consideration of necessity and to any notion of limits on Athenian hopes. This fits with their departure from Pericles' advice not to expand the empire while at war with the Peloponnesians, as during this time we see them picking up a territory here and there without any apparent thought for coherent strategy. Instead, the Athenians appear rather aimlessly restive and untethered in their actions by any noble aim or sound calculation of the city's advantage. When Cleon dies and Nicias and Alcibiades come to the center of Athenian politics, we see a further playing out of the difficulty we've been tracing. Despite the fact that neither man has Cleon's nastiness, both leaders follow him in undermining further their fellow citizens' sense of the city's nobility. Nicias attacks Alcibiades, who has already been chosen to lead the expedition to Sicily, as corrupt. Alcibiades attacks all his detractors as irredeemably inferior to himself. Nicias calls the Athenians' imperialism sick and suggests they want to fool others into thinking they're more impressive than they actually are. Alcibiades says the city's imperial practices may not be the best, but everyone is stuck with them because the alternative is that the Athenians will eat each other. There may well be truth to all of these claims, but it's still the case that such talk deepens the impression that the city is unworthy of devotion. In addition, no one justifies the Sicilian expedition in terms of its nobility, no one makes good arguments for it, and the plan for the much expanded form it eventually takes is hatched by a man attempting to propose something so unattractive that the whole thing will be called off. We spoke earlier of Thucydides' description of the Athenians' eros for this expedition. The last time in the work we heard about Athens' eros was in Pericles' funeral oration, when, we recall, Pericles exhorted his audience to romantic devotion to the city and then spoke of immortal glory. Here we see several of the same powerful forces at work in the Athenian souls, but now no one is at the wheel. Everyone's hopes and thoughts are unfocused, but stronger than ever and with a more harmful, limitless quality. To repeat, some are thinking of endless money, others are inclined to a hazier idea of simply attaining, quote, that which is not present. All are hoping for immortality, but in a more dangerous and foolish harm than glory promises. And the question of the possibility of fulfilling any of these aims is not raised. Indeed, other details of the account make one wonder whether the expedition is desired in part because the Athenians are aware of a growing moral void in the city. In any event, while Thucydides thought that under different circumstances Athens could have prevailed in Sicily, and that the most obvious blunders were yet to come, we see from all this the deterioration of post-Periclean leadership was well underway by this point, and I hope that that deterioration can be understood in part in terms of leaders' mismanagement of an intractable part of human nature. Thank you.